Hello, friends, and welcome to The Membership, a podcast about the works and life of Wendell Berry, the farmer, poet, novelist, essayist, activist, and thinker. My name is Jason Hardy, and I'm joined by two fellow members.
This is John Pattison.
This is Tim Wasem.
Well, hey guys, we've arrived at our first poetry episode. This is, I should have mentioned, episode 3. So we are introducing today the third person of the Wendell Berry genre trinity. So
I said we've made our first cycle.
Yeah, exactly. So before we jump into the poems that we read for today, I wonder if you guys might indulge me a little bit. I don't know about you guys, but when I meet and talk with other Wendell Berry appreciators, usually the conversation ends up with us comparing sort of our ranking of his work in the three genres: poetry, fiction, nonfiction. So I'd love to hear from you guys. Which genre do you think is his strongest, or I guess has stood out most to you?
Well, actually, for me, I think I don't know if I could say that it's his strongest, but it is certainly my favorite, and that's actually the poetry. I've been looking forward to getting into talking about the poetry, as I'm sure we'll get into our poems for today in his vast collection of works of poetry. Like, these are among my least favorite. Still really good, still a lot to talk about, but man, I love his poetry. I have made a regular practice of reading his poetry, both the collected poems as well as the Sabbath poems. Often in the morning, I'll read a poem or two before I start my own writing, just as a sort of way of getting connected with language. I think that they are often a really lovely distillation of his ideas and values. And when I recommend books to people, I'll ask some questions first, but I'm just as likely to recommend a book of poetry as I am anything else. And in fact, I will often recommend his poetry to people I know who don't often read poetry. I think that's I've noticed folks connecting quite a bit with that. Again, maybe especially his Sabbath poems.
Yeah, I think I've given away 4 or 5 copies of the Timbered Choir.
Yeah.
Over the years, it's just one of those that you're just kind of eager to just pass along to somebody. For me, I would say I would go with the fiction. For me, and I've talked before about how the essays are what I'm just least familiar with. I just haven't spent as much time in those as I have in the other two genres. But I think I'm drawn to the fiction in large part because the things that I get from his poetry and that I get from the essays that I do read, I feel like they get injected into the fiction as well. I'm sure it happens in the other direction too, but it's like you read his novels and you see the messages, and not all of them, but the messages of his essays get integrated in as a story, and you see it happening. And then same with the poetry and the language. I think the way that he writes, his language in writing his fiction and writing his poetry isn't that far off from one another, especially the later poems. I think these earlier ones are a little more like poemy than he gets. I'll get into that later, but I just feel like his poems later on breathe a lot more, and it mirrors his fiction. So I think that's the reason why I'm drawn there, and of course the reason that I started with the fiction. So it's always just kind of special to me. It's what I return to most often.
Yeah.
What about you, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's actually the nonfiction, and I think
plan this, folks.
We really didn't. We didn't have this conversation before we got on. Honestly, the nonfiction, I guess, is just what I've read most of, and I've probably read the least of his poetry. I've read a good bit of it, but certainly not all. I mean, I think the nonfiction is always just sort of what stood out to me is he really helped me sort of expand my definitions of things as a person, as a thinker, as someone who considers myself a Christian. And so I think that his nonfiction hit me right at the right time, I think, and so it's definitely had the most impact on me, I guess I'd say. So that's cool.
Jason, are you? I know Tim. I know that you're a writer and that you write fiction among other things. And so this is a question for both of you, but I actually don't know Jason well enough yet to know if you're a writer as well. And if so, I'm curious, within those respective genres, Tim, for you, the fiction, Jason, for you, the nonfiction, have they changed? Do you feel like they affect how you write?
I'd say for myself, yeah, absolutely. I don't do much writing these days, but I do enjoy writing nonfiction, actually, and that's partly because I was exposed to Wendell Berry's nonfiction around the time when I was in college, studying, taking a lot of writing classes. So absolutely, his nonfiction has influenced my writing.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, I don't think the style that I tend to write in sounds much like Wendell Berry's stuff. I think there are other writers that I probably am more like. If you read it on the page, you would see more of a direct influence, like who I'm trying to copycat. And I almost when I read Wendell Berry's stuff, I don't know. It doesn't translate into my own writing because I feel like his comes from wherever he is. Like, it comes from his place, and I can't. And I think there might have been a time where I try to like mimic it, but it just doesn't happen, and I don't enjoy doing that. But I think maybe for the biggest influence that it has on my writing is trying to write something that has the same kind of heartbeat to it, or the same sort of soul at the center of it. That it just feels. I guess it does affect my fiction writing in that I feel like I'm trying to write my own version of what he's doing. It doesn't sound like him, but just my stories end up talking about my home and my place, and trying to make them just as grounded.
It seems like that's what he would prefer. When I was in a senior, and not really a senior, but like late high school, early college, I was just starting to read like books that weren't the Hardy Boys. I read the Hardy Boys way too late.
Nice.
Into as a teenager. So I remember discovering the short stories of O. Henry, and I read so much O. Henry that my writing began to mimic his. And it took me years to disentangle O. Henry from my writing. I wish I had been reading Wendell Berry all that time,
right?
So that it sounded more, I don't know, that it had more Wendell Berry-like qualities than O. Henry.
Hey, could have been worse, though. Yeah.
Yeah.
O. Henry's...
Could have been... Oh, gosh, what's the guy's name who wrote the Hardy Boys? I forget.
Franklin W. Dixon?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's it.
We actually we went to a trip to Hendersonville and bought Henry his first 2 Hardy Boy books.
Nice.
To read aloud to him sometime soon.
Yeah.
Jason, are you any relation?
I'm not. I was considering whether I would share this, but to risk too much of a tangent, I'll say that I went back home and visited my parents, and my mom had pulled out this book that I had written in 3rd grade. One of those just plain white books that you wrote in, and they had you illustrate, and I wrote this thing called A Hardy Boys Christmas. And the picture on the front was a wreath with sticks of dynamite coming out of it. So
Here's your album cover.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man! But we should talk about someone else's book.
We can talk about my book that I've got sitting right over here on the shelf that I wrote when I was in
There you go.
kindergarten.
Yeah.
It's called The Chicago Bulls.
Nice.
So we'll save that for another day.
Good. Good. I hope to hear about it. So for today, we have read some selections from Wendell Berry's first collection of poems called The Broken Ground. This was published in 1964. So Berry had published some other poetry before this. He had several poems published in journals like Poetry Magazine and things like that. And he also had, this same year, a poem published about the death of John F. Kennedy. And I know, I actually have not read this, but I know both of you guys have. Do you guys want to say just a little bit about it?
Sure. Yeah, it's the title of it is November 26, 1963. And it's basically one poem that's an entire book. It's been spread over the course of a book. And the poem has been paired with illustrations by a guy named, is it Ben
Ben Shahn, maybe? S-H.
Ben Shahn. Oh yeah, 'cause it's
A-H-N.
handwritten, so it's hard. But I think it's Ben Shahn. So these poems are the images that are drawn with it are very kind of like pen and ink. They look like, or maybe like oil paint or something. It's kind of hard to tell with the printing, but yeah, it came out in 1963, I believe, or the poem itself was copyrighted in 1963. The drawings from Ben Shahn are 1964. He must have, Wendell Berry must have published this poem immediately after the assassination of Kennedy. Yeah, it's an interesting little book. It doesn't feel quite like anything else that Wendell Berry produced, which I'm sure he would agree with, being the first thing. I mean, so much has happened since then. But John, what were your first impressions of it?
I thought I was really moved by it. Well, I should say that the used copy that was sent to me, it reeks of gasoline. I think it had been in storage in somebody's garage for years, and so I had to air it out before I actually could really read it. But I thought it was really lovely. I thought it was interesting that he doesn't. I mean, obviously he's talking about the assassination, but he didn't choose to write about the day of the assassination. He is writing about the day of the funeral, which was I think an interesting artistic choice. Yeah, I think he captures sort of the mood of a country that's trying to figure out how they're going to go on. That the world has now fundamentally changed with the death of this popular young president with a young family, and he just seemed to embody so much promise. And now they have to go on. Yeah, I thought it was really lovely.
Yeah, I guess it does in some ways, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a little bit, but this poem feels more like later Wendell Berry than some of the poems that we read now, that we're going to read, which I guess in theory were written before this. I would assume that a large number of them would have been written before this, but and I can just read like the first few pages. I mean, I won't read the whole poem, but just to give people kind of a feel of it. In these first, I'll read 3 pages, and the images are, one is trees in wintertime, kind of at dark, really stark contrasts, and then one tree in the middle is broken and it's fallen down. Then there's a picture of a man on the ground, his face covered by it looks like his coat, and then the next is of a bird. So, we know the winter earth upon the body of the young president, and the early dark falling. We know the veins grown quiet in his temples and wrists, and his hands and eyes grown quiet. We know his name written in the black capitals of his death, and the mourners standing in the rain, and the leaves falling. We know his death's horses and drums, the roses, bells, candles, crosses, the faces hidden in veils. So every page, that was actually the first 4, but every page begins with the phrase "we know." So I would definitely recommend it. It's unfortunately we didn't mention that it's out of print, but you can find used copies. I think I got mine for about $6 or $7 on Amazon. And why do you think this poem isn't included in the collected poems?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, maybe it is just so different in terms of, in style, maybe it's more similar to some of his later work, but I don't know, subject matter it just doesn't seem to fit with most of what he writes in poetry. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess he doesn't. Yeah, I guess he doesn't write that much, or I don't know his poetry well enough to be able to say this definitively. But like topical poems,
right?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that. That is a good question as to why it's not included. Because I can think of some poems that are in here that are in the new collected poems that reference Vietnam, that reference the Cold War. Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not sure.
So yeah, I think it's it's worth having, and Wendell Berry fans would really love it. I guess it's also sort of a precursor to his later poems paired with images, with the woodcut images down the road. This is much more. It very much feels like a product of the '60s. It looks like the '60s, and then sounds like the '60s. I don't know. I'd recommend it, and I don't want to read the entire thing over here, but if you're able to pick up a copy, it's worth the $7 and the about 3 minutes of reading it. So
yeah, great. Well, to move on then to The Broken Ground, I guess I should say we are all reading from the what I'm assuming are a collection of about 20 poems from The Broken Ground that is in the new collected poems that was put out in 2012. So that's sort of the source material we're working with if you're reading along with us at home. I thought what I might do, we have such a developed idea of who Wendell Berry is, obviously, now, and he's the writer who moved back home and started farming and writes about agrarian themes and things like this. But this is when Wendell Berry was relatively unknown. This was his first full collection of poems. So I figured I found a picture of the original dust jacket of The Broken Ground, and I figured I'd read the sort of introductory copy that's on the dust jacket there and see what you guys' reaction to how they're presenting him is. It says, a young writer whose poem November 26, 1963, with drawings by Ben Shahn, published in the spring of 1964, was an immediate bestseller, offers here a particularly satisfying first book of poetry characterized by quiet strength and a serenity based on a compassionate understanding of the human condition. That's a super long sentence. A countryman born and reared, Wendell Berry is predominantly a pastoral poet. He writes about the elemental things of life and death and love, turning constantly to the natural world for his imagery. He writes of snow and rain and the waters of the earth, of birds and blooming trees, of country sounds and the qualities of light. The river runs to moon forever. The clear light rings with bees. Particularly in a number of extended poems and poem sequences, the mood is reflective, musing, elegiac. But there is humor too, and even occasional satiric thrust or flash of anger. Subtlety lies beneath the immoderate, forthright simplicity. An apparent effortlessness may initially conceal the fact that this is highly disciplined writing. Instantly appealing as they are, Wendell Berry's poems gain added stature as the reader comes to know them better and perceive fully their beauty and their unobtrusive power. So this is how the publishers chose to introduce Wendell Berry. What do you guys think about that?
Well, that's a lot to take in.
Yeah,
it's a pretty epic introduction
no kidding, right?
for him, especially for a first time, the first book published, or the first full book of a collection of poems published.
Yeah,
I did get hung up right at the beginning on the fact that they said November 26, 1963 was an instant bestseller.
Yeah.
Now, like, I don't doubt it, because it's a powerful little book, but that kind of explains why I was sort of shocked that it was so easy to find the book. If you look it up, there are used copies on Amazon, it's on eBay, it's on rare book sites, it's like all over the place. So I guess there were a lot more of them out there than I realized. It's interesting to think of him as a almost like the literary equivalent of a musician who like all of a sudden gets a hit song and then comes out with an album. It's an interesting way to start.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really liked how they were. I mean, and I think the description sort of carries along with his poems, that they're instantly appealing. They're sort of accessible, but the more you pay attention to them, sort of the more you get out of them. I think that could do as a general description of his poetry as a whole.
I agree.
Yeah.
I'll say that to me that feels less true of this particular collection than other collections.
Yeah,
That's what I was going to say, is that I feel like even the introduction was describing his later poems.
right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry, I cut you off. Go
No,
ahead.
that's it. I didn't have any more.
Cool. Well, yeah. Well, why don't we jump in then? What was you guys' sort of reaction to these poems from the Broken Ground?
So I love his poetry so much that, and there are certain poems of his that are among my all-time favorite poems by anybody, that Wendell Berry himself has set the standard pretty high. And I'm not saying that these poems don't meet the standard. They're just so different than the poems that I initially connected with reading his stuff, that I found these overly, honestly, I found there were a couple of them that I felt I would even describe as difficult, and not very accessible. I thought that they tended toward the abstract, whereas even though he talks a lot in his poetry about the things that he values, I feel like they're rooted in particular places and particular people. And there were some of those in here for sure, but there were times at which I felt like he was I don't know, like drifting somehow. And I also know that part of this is that a lot of these the poems that are from the Broken Ground that are included in the New Collected Poems are city poems, and that's just very, very different. And people who love Wendell Berry and live in the city, I don't, but live in the city, maybe they will. I don't know. Maybe they'll connect with these more than I did. But yeah, it was they were very different, and there's a reason why I had only read these poems from this collection one time before, like, needing to read them for the podcast, because I thought, well, one time is enough.
Yeah, I felt like, and I'm trying to think of a way to say this. It's not as harsh as I mean it to sound, but when I read these, my first reaction was like, these are very grad student poems.
Mm-hmm.
Like these feel like they were written in grad school. They're very good for being written in grad school, or like by a student, but they just had that feeling of like he was trying to find his voice, and he was feeling out like where he fits as far as his form of his poems and the subject matter of his poems. Because like you said, these are, and Jason, you had mentioned this the other day, that just they're urban, surprisingly urban poems. And there are points in it where he seems angry, and he seems just kind of unsettled, I guess is maybe a better word than angry. And as we know, not too long after this, he ends up going back to Kentucky.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't remember exactly when that is, but he's heading back, and so I couldn't help. I read the poems again today, and just the thought crossed my mind of like, these are poems by a guy who just really needs to go back home. he really needs to be back in Kentucky, because I think he's wrestling with these, I don't know, like almost like wrestling with these demons a little bit in this collection, where he's talking about, the version of ourself who's dying, like just walking ahead of us and like walking inevitably towards their end. And then he writes a lot about, I don't know, you call them like these like vagrant personalities who are kind of passing through towns and like aren't at home anywhere. It's like, dude, read your own poem, go home. I guess he did, but yeah, I mean, there were points of it where the Wendell Berry I know better, sparkled through in certain lines, and you'd get these little tastes of what he was going to become. But then that makes it fascinating in its own strange way for basically hearing a poet find his voice, and I'm glad he included it in the collection and didn't bury him or well, no pun intended.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that is totally fair and a good point. Like even though they're not my favorite, I'm glad that we get to see traces of sort of the journey that he's on as a person, being in New York City and then going back to Kentucky, but also as a writer. It's interesting. I pulled up the 1965 review from the New York Times of this collection. It's archived on the New York Times. There's not a single mention of him being a Kentucky writer.
Oh wow.
No mention of Kentucky at all.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So I like to say we'll have to save that link and we can put it in the show notes because that would be interesting to share.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I definitely agree with you guys. This is definitely early work. He is absolutely trying to find his voice, and he is trying some different things. And there is some definite spitefulness that's coming out in some of these poems. But at the same time, these you mentioned the vagrant personalities, Tim, that he sort of latches onto in some of the poems. I mean, I feel like there's some genuine empathy in there too, alongside that I really appreciated. So, I mean, he's in one of the poems. I should probably say which one it is. He's writing about I guess basically like it seems like a homeless person maybe who's walking down the street in the middle of the day just singing at the top of his lungs. And just sort of that is an image, and he's not casting this, he's casting this in definitely like a positive light. And, then there's the blind guy playing a mandolin in the subway tunnel, and you can tell Wendell Berry doesn't like the subway tunnel, but he really appreciates the beauty that this mandolin player is throwing into that place. So I actually am really...
To Go By Singing was the first one.
Yeah, To Go By
To
Singing.
Go By Singing.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
The second one is A Music. So like I'm actually probably more drawn towards urban imagery personally. So I appreciated that about these poems, even though I think you all are absolutely right that he's definitely finding himself here, and there is that sort of edge to some of these poems that you can just kind of tell he's a little unsettled.
Jason, to go along with the two poems that you just mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
There's another one similar to that called The Guest, where he has encountered a man who's asking for money, and he has the man has his hand out, and in that poem, Wendell Berry is much much harder on himself than he is on the man asking for money. Wendell Berry says about himself, I nearly believe, the Samaritan who fell into the ambush of his heart on the way to another place. My stranger waits, his hand held out like something to read, as though its emptiness is an accomplishment. I gave him a smoke and the price of a meal, no more. Not sufficient kindness or believable sham. I paid him to remain strange to my threshold and table, to permit me to forget him, knowing I won't. He's the guest of my knowing, though not asked.
Yeah.
This guy's like holding out his hand, an open hand, waiting to receive something from Berry, and in reaching out and giving him just enough, Berry's able to keep him at arm's length.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so true, right? I mean, that's definitely an experience I've had. I've felt like, I've handed people some money, and just, if I'm honest about my motivations, it's just to sort of not feel bad about myself and to be able to move on with my day,
I've heard the phrase toxic charity used.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't tell you exactly what they mean by that.
Right.
But that's what came to mind reading that poem. Like, here's a charity. It's just enough charity to make you feel like you're freed from responsibility of actually developing relationships.
Right. Yeah. And
I do that too.
So it's toxic for us as the ones who would be extending the charity, right?
Yeah, that's right.
For sure. Well, I think one of we've talked about the urban setting of most of these poems, which really is, if you're used to the Wendell Berry of the Sabbath poems, it's really kind of disorienting to drop into this collection and have all of that there. One of the themes that seems to be sort of going throughout a lot of these poems is the idea of death and sort of reckoning with death. And I wondered if I could share. It's a short poem, but I think it's my favorite from this collection, and I think a really interesting one to think about in terms of I'm always probably going to be drawn to Wendell Berry's thinking about religion. And this poem is really interesting in that light. It's called Canticle, and I'll read it here. What death means is not this: the spirit triumphant in the body's fall, praising its absence, feeding on music. If life can't justify and explain itself, death can't justify and explain it. A creed and a grave never did equal the life of anything. Yellow flowers sprout in the clefts of ancient stones at the beginning of April. The black clothes of the priest are turned against the frail yellow of sunlight and petal. They wait in their blackness to earn joy by dying. They trust that nothing holy is free, and so their lives are paid. Money slots in the altar rails make a jukebox of the world, the mind paying its gnawed coins for the safety of ignorance.
Those last 4 lines are pretty fantastic. That they trust that nothing holy is free. That one jumped out. Dove off the page, and then just the imagery, the money slots and the altar rails make a jukebox of the world. The mind paying its gnawed coins for the safety of ignorance. I love that image.
And
so what made you? What drew you to that one?
Yeah, I think
Jason?
it's really interesting. I mentioned that I was drawn to Wendell Berry particularly because he spoke about the Christian tradition in a different way than I was used to, and in a way that sort of expanded my view of what was possible within the Christian tradition. This is some of the... he doesn't really have to have anything good to say about religion here. So it sort of it surprised me, and yet at the same time, I think it's super relevant to me anyway, in this question of how much of my religion is about an afterlife or the next world, and how much of it is about living in the world that God has already created. And this sort of he seems in a lot of these poems to be saying that in order to be free to enjoy the world as it is, we have to reckon with death. We have to reckon with the fact that it's going to happen, and that is sort of part of the natural cycles of things. And the answer is not, he seems to be saying here, to sort of put your hope in something that comes after death, but rather to use that to make you more appreciative of the life that you have.
That's what they got from that. Trust that nothing holy is free was a line that just spoke as being about the good things aren't the easy things, right? The things that make this world good, and the things that make life worth living are not the things that are just the easiest and most enjoyable. I think it definitely, when I read this poem, it makes me feel rooted in an attitude of, if you want hope in the future, then you need to be doing what you can here and now in ways that are, in what is the David Foster Wallace, like in petty, unsexy, or in not in ways that aren't petty, little unsexy actions. And things.
Interesting. Like I actually read that a completely different way.
Well, what did you?
Yeah, I read that as they trust that nothing holy is free, meaning you're not in the world that you're given, that we're given. There's nothing holy. We have to pay in a life of, flesh denying penance, essentially, in order to achieve, something holy in a next life.
And you're probably more on the right track than I did. I think I have a tendency when I read poetry to when I read poetry, the things I take out of it often, I don't know why, but I feel okay sometimes with taking lines out of context.
Oh, absolutely,
and just, letting those words sort of like wash over me and let them just chew on them for a while. And I think maybe when you do put it into context, it does almost take. And when you talk about those gnawed coins later on, it does put maybe a little bit more of a cynical. Well, if you want to be holy, then you better put something in the offering plate. Right. You better pay up.
Yeah.
And I see what you're saying. I think I think I have a tendency to do that more than I realize.
Yeah. And I mean, later on, Wendell Berry, he's certainly always ambivalent about the influence of at least contemporary institutional Christianity on, the way we think about the world. But he definitely makes his peace with the Christian tradition and claims it later on. I don't know enough about his biography to know if maybe he didn't even want to do that at this point. I'm not sure. It's just, something that interested me.
This was definitely one of my favorite poems from the ones that we read. And you mentioned the last 4 lines. For me, it begins... and those last 4 lines are great, but like even in the line or two ahead of that, where he talks about the black clothes of the priests are turned against the frail yellow of sunlight and petal. They wait in their blackness to earn joy by dying. And throughout my reading of these poems, because death really is a theme, I was thinking about a mentor of mine who died pretty unexpectedly, maybe a week and a half ago. And he was a guy who talked a lot about heaven. He had this thing that he would say, and his family knew it, and I had heard it 100 times. He used to say that the best is yet to come. And yet for somehow, there are people who would say that, who would be looking ahead to the afterlife and would deprive themselves of all of the free and lovely gifts of this world. And he was not like that. He laughed more than anyone I have ever known. Like, he laughed so much that my laugh started to sound like his. I wonder what the difference is between people who look forward to heaven and think of it as, and can say that the best is yet to come, and it makes them just live into the earthly life with even more gusto. And then the others who say, it's all going to burn anyway, so we can treat it like crap. And, I'm not sure the difference between what makes one person go one direction, the other, and the other person the other direction. But I mean, they have their backs to the yellow flowers, right there.
And I wonder, it's talking about the beginning of April and the priest in black clothes. I mean, that made me think of the being in Lent around that time, right? I mean, the church calendar is something that's definitely really meaningful to me in terms of a seasonality of spiritual life. But there are times when you're struck that, this is Lent, this is this period of sort of training ourselves in penitence, and yet it's like the most beautiful time of the year. all the flowers are coming out, and that's what that made me think of, for sure.
That was a good choice. That's a great poem.
Yeah. Tim, what about you? What poems sort of stood out to you?
I think I'm trying to decide which one I want to bring up, and And the one, I don't know, maybe like the sleeper pick poem that I want to pick, and I can't really put my finger on why, but maybe talking to you guys will help. But I'm going to read a poem called "The Wild," and this is right after "To Go By Singing." And it stuck out to me because of part of it was the urban aspect of it, but in some ways I felt like he was describing an urban setting in a way that reflected the way he would some days describe the fields behind his house on his property, which was interesting to me. So I'll read it. This is "The Wild." In the empty lot, a place not natural but wild, among the trash of human absence, the slough and shamble of the city's seasons, a few old locusts bloom. A few woods birds fly and sing in the new foliage. Warblers and tanagers, birds wild as leaves, and a million each one would be rare, new to the eyes. A man couldn't make a habit of such color, such flight and singing, but they're the habit of this wasted place. In them the ground is wise. They are its remembrance of what it is. And I think those last few lines where he says he's talking about these birds, and he says, "In them the ground is wise, and they are its remembrance of what it is." I guess the way I read that is I'm hearing him write about a place that is a very urban setting that clearly wasn't always an urban setting forever, and that like there are these little pockets that this empty lot that doesn't have this one rare place that doesn't have a building put on it is kind of a holdout, a little piece of history, a little like museum to what might have been here before. There's these two old locust trees, and the way that he describes their blooming, and the way that he describes these birds that just seem out of place in the city. Like where did they come from? They're wild as leaves. A million each one would be rare that he's seeing in this place, and that it's almost like a reminder that even when you're in a city setting, in an urban setting, there are lots of opportunities to see the remnants of what once was, and to see them in a positive sense, to be like, that notion of in them the ground is wise, in them this place still has its character down there somewhere. We can mourn for it, but know that this whole place, this whole thing that we're seeing right now wouldn't exist, and it wouldn't be what it is without where it came from, without the land, and without these birds and this grass and these trees. So I don't know. It had that feeling of a future Wendell Berry poem in a way that it was just intriguing to me. So I don't know if that one stuck out to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, it really did. I mean, that kind of image of sort of an oasis of the natural world within the, this is New York City. So the artificial urban world around it, it's just such a fruitful image, a powerful image. And I like what you said about it being like a museum to the natural world, and in a lot of ways this poem sort of goes hand in hand with the next one, May Song, where he's talking about in this one the sort of the weeds or the flowers that are growing up in between the cracks in the pavement, right? It's not so much it's a museum, it's like they are finding a way to come back, to sort of reclaim what was there, trying to find a good just line or two of that poem to read. But it is itself the possessor we know at last, seeing it send out weeds to take back whatever's left, proprietor pasturing foliage in the rubble, making use of the useless, a beauty we have less than not deserved. Such a great image.
Reminds me of that book, The World After Us, or whatever it's called, that came out a few years ago. That kind of like if humans disappeared, like what would happen to nature, and talks about like how long it would take for nature to overtake certain aspects of the cities, and what would remain and what would not. But actually reading both of those poems, and especially as you guys talk about them now. By the way, these poems are starting to grow on me now that we're talking about them. So that's something to keep in mind, both for myself and for the listeners too. That if there's something that doesn't connect with you, maybe some conversation will help. But so what came to mind for me is it's one of Wendell Berry's other poems. It's called "How to Be a Poet to Remind Myself." That's one of my all-time favorites. And he says in there, there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. And I think in both of these poems, he's talking about, in the first, he's talking about a place that isn't desecrated yet. And in the other, I feel like he is describing perhaps a place that's being re-sacralized, if that's a word. And I actually feel like it's part of this is something I talk about in relationship to community development. I would say that as like for faith-based, community-minded people, I believe that's one of our jobs and privileges is the re-sacralization of our places. And sometimes we do that by cultivating with intention, and other times we leave well enough alone because the land will take care of it. Like there's a genius in each place that that's still there, that still remains. The ground is wise, as he says in The Wild. Yeah.
Well, this reminds me, and you're talking about that book about, the Earth after humans. It reminds me of, I actually discovered the poet, sort of middle 20th century poet Edwin Muir, from reading Wendell Berry. He quotes him in several places, and I think Standing by Words. And there's a poem that he has. It's called, I think it's just called The Horses. And I like to describe it as if Wendell Berry were to write a post-apocalyptic poem, this would be it. But it's basically about, after some sort of cataclysmic event, like a nuclear holocaust or something, what happens to the world, and people are still around, but all of their radios don't work anymore, like there's no electricity, so they sort of turn back towards like farming. And it's just one of the big images that stood out to me in that poem is like all of the tractors started to be overgrown by weeds and by the grass, and like the earth is like swallowing them back up as just a really powerful image. And so,
are the tractors the horses?
No, and then the wild horses. The end of the poem is the wild horses come back. Like there are like herds of wild horses running around, and they start to come back, which is
that'd be weird.
Cool. Yeah. Super
no,
weird.
The tractors are the horses.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, any other poems you guys want to talk about, or any other anything else you think we need to hit about the broken ground?
I remember when I started reading for this episode, and this is actually, I think, before we even started recording, but I was going back into the poetry, and I was struck by the opening poem, Elegy.
Yeah.
Which is that's a little too long to read the whole thing, but it was a little, and maybe this is why he put it first, but this might be one of the most, that feels like the future stuff in some ways. This poem Elegy, and maybe the reason for that is that he's writing it for who I assume is his grandfather, Prior Thomas Berry. Yeah, I enjoyed this poem a lot, and there were some points of it that almost felt like notes of a Wendell Berry origin story kind of thing. And one part that I had marked for that said, "Behind us, rain breaks the corners of our father's house, quickens on the downslope to noise. Our steps clamor in his silence, who tracked the sun to autumn in the dust. Below the hill, the river bears the rain away that cut his fields their shape and stood them dry." Where he's talking about this place, and you just hear him talking about a place that he obviously knows well and understands how it works. He understands the anatomy of it. He feels something for it, and we find out from him that he inherited this land from his family, and this is maybe one of the more peaceful poems that he writes in this collection, and maybe it's because he's referring back to that time or to this place. And I was definitely struck by this poem. He says, water wearing the earth is the shape of the earth, the river flattening in its bends, their mingling held ponderable in his words, knowledge polished on a stone. River and earth and sun and wind disjoint, over his silence flows apart. His words are sharp to memory as cold rain, but are not ours. We stare dumb upon the fulcrum dust, across which death lifts up our love. There is no more to add to this perfection. We turn away into the shadow of his death. But I don't know if you guys would agree with that, but I just feel like this poem, I would maybe assume was a later addition to maybe one of the later poems that he wrote in this collection, because he feels to be not in the same place as he is in these kind of angsty city poems where he's talking about drifters and sounding angry, and we didn't approach the comments about the the comment about a certain woman airing her cat. He's got some strong words about her, but this is just a very peaceful poem.
Yeah, it definitely is. And yeah, absolutely out of these, this one certainly reminded me more of his later work.
Him talking about, as I guess we're presuming maybe a grandfather or someone, sort of no longer being a part of the land that he had cared for so long. It brings me back to that 1963 poem that we started with, the very last stanza. Writing about John F. Kennedy, Berry said, "We know the long approach of summers toward the healed ground, where he will be waiting, no longer the keeper of what he was."
Yeah, that's a great connection. It's a great connection, because in this poem you really get that sense of this person's is gone, but their hands have touched all of this, and they're responsible for what we see, and for what we're living within.
Yeah, and sort of their memory is sort of enmeshed in that place.
Absolutely. But I think overall, for me, I mean, I didn't dislike this first collection. I was kind of fascinated by how different it was from the stuff that I'm most familiar with, which I will admit that for me, I'm most familiar with a small pocket of his poetry, and that's really the Sabbath poems that I've spent the most time with. And then some of the more recent collections, like Leavings, I read that one a lot. But one thing I look forward to in reading these and getting to talk to you guys is to get better at talking about poetry.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to put his. I'm looking forward to putting his poetry into a context, like into its context within because I don't think he, earlier we were talking about how all of his writing kind of works together, which obviously it does. It just makes sense. That he has something to say, and then he asks himself, well, how am I going to say it? And so I'd like to better understand how the puzzle piece of poetry fits in with everything else. And I think, and this helps me a little bit, and it helps me understand where he's coming from and where he started. And I still can't help but hear most of this collection as a sort of catalyst for where he did end up, because he says in, I forget which essay it was, in The Long-Legged House, where he talks about being in the city and being at like basically the pinnacle of literary culture. Like, this is where everybody wants to be, right? You want to be in New York City, you want to be doing this, you want to be teaching this, you want to be writing it. And yet he saw the mountaintop, and what did he end up writing, and what did he end up feeling? Well, this. It sounds like he felt pretty shitty. He didn't feel very good, and he's conflicted, and that kind of catapulted him back to where he needed to be.
Yeah,
it's a lot of assumptions there, I know, on my part, but that's kind of my gut reaction, my gut interpretation of what we've read.
Right. Well, and so much of what even Wendell Berry writes about when he writes about his writing, like he did in The Long-Legged House, like he sees his life's vocation as a writer to have his place as his subject, and that's just, and he sort of does here in that. I mean, I guess he still has that. he's being faithful to the place that he's in, even if he doesn't think as highly of it. But, it's not until he moves back to Kentucky that we really get the Wendell Berry that we know, because the Wendell Berry that we know is writing about that place. All right. Well, this has been fun, guys, talking about poetry for the first time. Definitely looking forward to doing that some more.
Yeah, kind of finding my legs personally.
Likewise.
With talking about his poetry, so I'm looking forward to it as well. And I think all of us are kind of chomping at the bit to someday getting to these Sabbath poems, which we're like a couple decades away from getting to or something. I don't know whenever those started. Was it the late 70s, or was it not until the 80s that he started the Sabbath poems?
I think it was in late 70s.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And that's a couple decades in Wendell Berry time, not in podcast time.
Yeah.
Right.
He started.
Thankfully,
those started in 79.
Cool.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking. And then I feel like I have to. We're going to say that kind of thing so much that I appreciate listeners reading along with us in this order, and I think we're trying to do it in a very intentional way that we're going through, and I'm glad we're doing it this way. But those of you who are listening, we definitely encourage you to just get the Sabbath poems out and just start reading them, because they're so fantastic.
Don't wait.
Don't
Absolutely.
wait. Not at all.
Yeah. Well, so next time, for our fellow members, our listeners are reading along with us, we're going to talk about fiction again. And again, we're going in chronological order in Port William time. So the next two stories that we'll read, two short stories, Fly Away Breath and A Consent. And those are both in That Distant Land, and you can also get them in the Library of America collection as well. Want to remind everyone that you can connect with us online at our website, membershippod.com, and on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Our handle for all three of those is membershippod. We're at membershippod. So thanks, y'all, and looking forward to talking with you next time.
The Membership Podcast is a proud member of the Rabbit Room Podcast Network. All readings from tonight's episode can be found in the new collected poems released by Counterpoint Press.